This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This episode is produced in partnership with the Leonid Nevzlin Center for Russian and East European Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. My guest today is a Rabbi Edward Sandrow Chair in Soviet and East European Jewry there at the Hebrew University, and the academic chairman of the Nevzlin Center. Other than his cutting-edge research, he was recently in the news after his son Sagi was kidnapped from his home in Kibbutz Nir Oz on the 7th of October and held hostage in Gaza for nearly 500 days until his release in February 2025. Professor Jonthan Dekel-Chen, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me.
So many people see the predicament of Israelis, the fact that they cannot live in peace and security in their own place under the sun, simply as an extension of their long history as victims of hostility and persecution. In fact, this was the predicament that Zionism was meant to resolve in the first place. But the arc of history, as this story goes, proved more powerful. What is your take on this historiosophical proposition as a historian who studied a significant chapter in its crystallization and as a Jewish individual who experienced its latest iteration?
Well, what you've suggested here is a fairly well-accepted interpretation of the creation of Israel, the Zionist movement, and what has happened since then, and it revolves mainly around victimization. I would say that the history of the Jewish people is much more complex and subtle than that, including the creation of Zionism, including our lives here in a sovereign Jewish state. There are enemies. There are certainly enemies and always have been of the Jewish people and of Israel. But together with that, the Jewish people have always had, perhaps omitting, a 400 period of slavery, have always had agency of one kind or another. So the tension here has always been between this dealing with enemies, great and small, wherever Jews happen to be, because anti-Semitism is a real thing, but also how do we, as individuals and as a people, express our agency, our own power and empowerment. And that is a real tension, and it is just as true, just as apparent as the existence of anti-Semitism in the world.
And this is the difference between today and Russia 100 years ago, that now, as a sovereign state, Jews have that agency that they didn't have 100 years ago? Or is it also more complex than that?
It's more complex than that. Of course, the existence of a sovereign state with an army, with intelligence services, with an economy, it changed forever. The landscape for Jews, certainly vis-a-vis the previous 2,000 years. That being said, even the Jews of Russia or Eastern Europe, for the most part, always had choices to make. They could be good choices, they could be bad choices, they could be tragic, but there were choices to be made within the environments in which they lived in ways similar, not identical, to choices that other peoples living in those spaces at those times had to make, to stay, to leave, to fight, to not, to join, to refuse. These are all things that Jews have always faced and always had to make decisions. That's agency.
Yeah, but they had to make choices, you say, as much as anyone else, but it was different for them back then, being Jews in a largely hostile environment.
Absolutely. But things change over time, and it's also a matter of perception. At any given point, and this is true today, and it was true in Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s, Jews might perceive themselves as victims, but in the eyes of others, simultaneously, they can be seen as aggressors. And we can dismiss that as just another manifestation, of course, of anti-Semitism. But as historians, we need to take closer looks at what was actually going on in the context of those times and try to put aside, at least while we're doing our work, so these preconceptions about, forever victimization.
Mm-hmm. What sort of message did the Soviet Union bring upon its establishment to the Jews? I mean, on paper at least, it was the most progressive political project of the time, especially when it comes to racism, discrimination, etc. How did that come about? And take us through the meanders of that moment in history.
Well, there's a prehistory to this. Of course, the Soviet Union is created in late 1917, or Soviet Russia, as it was called at the time. But there is a prehistory to this, which is the history of socialism, of socialist movements, socialist parties, utopian movements, and all of them proposed at one degree or another equality. Equality not based on class, not based on religion, not based on nationalities, but rather a kind of brotherhood or sisterhood, a universal peoplehood. And so it spoke to many, many Jews, mostly younger Jews, but also some not so young Jews, in the same way that other movements that were swirling around them, Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, spoke to them, if it's that Jewish Enlightenment or at times nationalism of one kind or another, not just Jewish nationalism, sometimes Polish nationalism, for example. The Bolsheviks, once they did come to power in October of 1917, this was a different animal because they now had an actual country that they were ruling. And very early on, made it clear that, at least on paper, Jews, for the first time, pretty much anywhere, were going to be accepted as citizens with full rights. Anti-Semitism was outlawed under that same Bolshevik constitution. On the one hand, there was a kind of affirmative action for Jews and other minority peoples, but at the other end of this, there were also ways in which this same Bolshevik regime, in which there were a disproportionate number of certainly Jews by birth in its leadership, made life hard for sort of everyday Jews. For example, the Bolshevik Constitution of 1918 took away those same civil rights from anyone who was considered someone who had been a class oppressor before the revolution. And as it turned out, somewhere between 40 to 70% of all Jews at that time in the Soviet Union came under that categorization, which made their daily lives challenging. But they were challenged not simply because they were Jews. In fact, being Jewish had nothing to do with it. This was a class identification, but it just so happened that a disproportionate number of Jews fell under it.
It made their lives hard in what way?
Well, it made it difficult, for example, for them to, very first, access to food, access to higher education for themselves and for their children, government jobs, which is a big deal in what was developing as a command economy. But the Soviet Union at the same time gave Jews and non-Jews ways by which they could recover their civil rights through what they called productive work. And Jews seized upon that. And so very quickly, Jews went, in the context of the Soviet Union, from sort of the tail of, the backside tail of the Russian economy, for the most part, pre-1917, to total engagement in this new, industrialized, educated Soviet economy. And, by the time Soviet and then ex-Soviet Jews were arriving in Israel, after following or as a part of an exodus, late 1980s, early 1990s, with the coming apart of the Soviet Union, the people who were coming down the ramp from the airplanes in Ben Gurion Airport, this wasn't, Tevye the dairyman anymore. These were doctors, scientists, geologists, you name it. And that was a result of the engagement of Jews in this new Soviet world that, of course, was not all roses. There were very difficult periods, but if you take the long trajectory of the Soviet period, at least on the professional level, compared to their non-Jewish neighbors in the Soviet Union, this is a very complicated story. It's not just a story of oppression.
Yeah. Well, where does the actual experience and the memory of the Second World War come in? I mean, the great enemy was, of course, Nazi Germany. It was the great enemy of the Jews as and the Second World War for Soviet Russia, for the Soviet Union, was this great patriotic war. Where did the Jews come into that matrix? Not just in the day-to-day life, but also as part of the the national narrative.
Well, in this way, Soviet Jews, or the narrative, is, as you've said, about the Jews during the Second World War in the Soviet Union, in some ways it's quite similar to what happened in the United States. These are the two great powers involved in the war to defeat Nazi Germany and, of course, Japan, but we'll deal with Nazi Germany. And for both of these leaders and the leaderships, be they in Moscow or in Washington, D.C., they had to be able to explain to their population, and certainly on the Soviet side, where the sacrifice was so much greater, loss of civilian life, property, and of course also the death of soldiers. They had to be able to explain that sacrifice in ways that the general population would accept it. And they both understood, Stalin and Roosevelt, names that we usually don't associate with each other, they both understood at some level that launching their countries in a crusade to save Europe's Jews as the primary focus was not going to be helpful to the general war effort, which they both recognized for different reasons was critical for their nations. So both during the war and even after the war, the full story or the full scope of what happened to Europe's Jews during the war remained shrouded for decades after the war. That would also be true, certainly in the Soviet Union, of Jewish heroism during the war. Of all of the Soviet peoples, the Jews, certainly amongst the minority peoples, the sacrifice of young Jews on the battlefield and in partisan units was extraordinarily high, proportionately speaking. The Soviet Union chose not to highlight that in public, but they also did not highlight, for the most part, the sacrifice of Ukrainians, of Belarusians, of the Siberian peoples, because they very much needed for this great patriotic war to be about a total national effort, and not specific to this or that component group in the Soviet Union, which, in many cases have never been happy or never happy until 1991 about being part of the Soviet Union. And sort of the greatest single case of that are the Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm. So did the Jews benefit from that sort of a new national project?
The post-1991 project?
No, in the post-1940, during the war, and the fact that they were part of this big national project.
Well, they certainly took immense pride in what they had done, but they also had an enormous amount of mourning to do, because the brutal statistics are that percentage-wise, the percentage of Soviet Jews who were murdered, those who were caught in Nazi-occupied territories, was the highest of anywhere in Europe. It went somewhere between 95 to 99% of those Soviet Jews who were taken by the German army were murdered during the course of that occupation. So, it's a very mixed bag. It's both pride in true heroism, but also this horrific moment in which the scale of the destruction began to be known throughout the Soviet Union.
To what extent does the scale of the destruction really contribute to that evolution of the Soviet Jew? You said that those coming off the ramps at Ben Gurion Airport in 1991 were very different from Tevye. So we're looking at also I'm asking you about the physical destruction of these communities. First of all, earlier on, during the Great Emigration out of the Pale of Settlements to America and elsewhere, but also a few decades later with the war, as you said, that left almost nothing but destruction. To what extent did that play a role in that evolution of this Soviet Jew?
Well, that's a course worth of material at the university level. But I'll give you two examples of how the Second World War so deeply changed and in many ways devastated the Jews of Eastern Europe in general, but the Soviet Union as a whole. The first would be geographic. The majority of Soviet Jews, until the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they lived in areas that were more or less in what had been called the Pale of Settlement. So that is, for today's Ukraine, Belarusia, western parts of the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, and so on. The Holocaust caused the annihilation of those Jews. At the same time, the Soviet Union saved many, many hundreds of thousands of its own citizens by evacuating them to the eastern parts of the Soviet Union, more internal parts where the Soviets were trying to reconstitute their heavy industry and farming and so on.
With an intention to save them?
Well, not necessarily to save Jews, but to save itself, the
Right.
Soviet Union, because they could not let all of the Soviet industry fall into the hands of the Germans. So it was deconstructed and shipped east to places where Jews had not lived really in numbers before. The Jews were there simply because they happened to work in these factories. And, they added on to the evacuation, with their siblings and their mom and their auntie and grandma also got on those trains for evacuation to places like Karaganda, places like Tashkent, in the Soviet interior, where essentially new or either new Jewish communities formed, or they added on to very small existing Jewish communities there. So you had an eastward shift, but that would be the demographic implication. I would say the social cultural implication was that the old world of Judaism, what had been able to survive the first 20 or so years of Soviet control in Eastern Europe, that too was annihilated. These shtetls, that shtetl life, the insular Jewish life of the shtetl, essentially was annihilated by the German army. And so what remained after the war were Jewish communities or Jews who were not as isolated and compact into small communities, and certainly not as religiously focused as they had been at any point in the past. So all of these factors led to a post-war Soviet Jewry that at first, and it changed over time, but at first it was a more spread out than it had been across the Soviet Union. And it was becoming more and more socialized or acculturated to general Soviet culture, meaning less Yiddish, more Russian, less religious observance, more involvement in a lifestyle that we would associate more with your classic Soviet citizen. So more about chess than going to the Stiebel.
And what about the areas that they left? I mean, how did their absence, the sudden evacuation, and the destruction of so much of it change the landscape, both urban and human, in the western parts of the Soviet Union? Was there during the war and straight after, any sort of a hint of its a bygone Jewish heritage?
Well, certainly. I mean, Jews did return in the Soviet Union. Jews did return. So if in Gomel or in Minsk, there was barely a Jew alive in certainly until the German army was rolled back. Over time, those communities, perhaps not the original community, but a new Jewish community would reconstitute itself thereafter in these places. But it would be a fundamentally different Jewish community because, again, the fathers, the grandfathers were all gone. This would become a much more Sovietized Jewish community, but there were certainly always signs, and there's great scholarship about this, sort of how Jewish identity continued in the Soviet Union, but in ways that perhaps other Jews in the diaspora or Israeli Jews wouldn't necessarily recognize and maybe couldn't appreciate at the time, but ways of identifying as Jews and keeping alive a heritage that wasn't based on Jewish ritual, for sure.
Was it against this backdrop that the whole phenomenon of Zionism and the prisoners of Zion and all that came to prominence in the 1970s, right, more or less? Was it really a result of this evolution in the nature of the Soviet Jew?
Well, there are still debates, even amongst the activists themselves. What sparked this renewal of interest in Zionism? Because Zionism, until the revolution in 1917, and for some years after, had been very popular in this Russian-speaking space. And a lot of the first and second and even third aliyot, the first waves of aliyah to Palestine, it came from these spaces. But it had been more or less eradicated in the Soviet Union because it was considered a national chauvinist movement, like many others. There are those who will say, and it cannot be disproven, that it never really went away. It survived very quietly, sort of in the closet. And the fact is that there were young Jews being arrested for Zionist activities in the late 40s and the early 1950s in the Soviet Union. It really only becomes visible, however, after the Six-Day War. There are many conjectures as to why exactly during the Six-Day War there was this awakening of Jewish national pride. I think it's a complicated answer to try and give in a very short time. There are those who believe that it was a direct result of Israel's victory, and perhaps more importantly, and we tend to forget this, the real possibility that had Israel not preempted in 1967, it would have been destroyed. And the Soviet Jews were aware of this, and that frightened them very much.
What about the alignment of the Soviet Union with Israel's enemies? That the Soviet Union was about to aid and abet Israel's
Well, it certainly was.
destruction.
It had been arming Israel's enemies for years before that, and that made life very complicated for Jews. But many of them made a choice after 1967 that while they were not, for the vast majority of them, were not in opposition to the Soviet Union. That was not the movement. The movement was one of two things: either the right to emigrate, right of movement to emigrate to Israel, or religious freedom inside of the Soviet Union. There was an accelerant moment, and I don't know if your listeners, those who are old enough to remember, but in 1970, a small group of young Soviet Zionists attempted to hijack a plane in Leningrad. It's kind of a boneheaded plan. It didn't work. It may never have been intended to really succeed. The conspirators were all put on show trial and delivered very serious sentences, death sentences to some of them, by the Soviet court. And that created a global outcry. Eventually, most their sentences were shortened and the death penalties canceled entirely. But that also did something to Soviet Jews. It showed them, the young Soviet Jews, that here there were people just like them, young Jews, who were willing to make kind of an ultimate sacrifice in order to get to Israel. And that created a great deal more motivation. So all of these movements, they sprouted kind of from this general environment of identification A dear colleague of mine, Tzvi Gittleman from the University of Michigan, he's sort of the don of one of the two dons of Soviet Jewish history, called it thin identity, thin Jewish identity, but it's there. And it determined many choices that many Soviet Jews made over the years.
Was it really a very popular movement? Was it something like a household idea? These people, the defendants of the Leningrad trials, household names, national heroes for Soviet Jews?
Depends who you ask. If you ask, of course, the activists, some of whom actually wound up in Israel years later, their families, their fellow activists, and of course it was sort of the biggest game in town, or in Jewish town in any case. But in interviews and just in conversation with the far larger numbers of Jews who came to Israel from the late 80s into the 1990s, it was not necessarily a very well-known movement inside of the Soviet Union. It was loud, but not very well-known. And the fact of the matter is, at that time, 1970s essentially, there are a little over 2 million Jews in the Soviet Union of all sizes and shapes, and spread from the western edge of the Soviet Union to Krasnoyarsk or to Vladivostok in the east. And of those 2.5 million Jews, about 500,000, so anywhere between a quarter to a fifth of them, applied. You had to apply, which was a kind of dangerous thing, or risky thing to begin with. You had to apply for an exit visa. 500,000 applied. We'll ignore for the moment how many were allowed to leave and where they went to, because that's another question.
That's in the 1980s?
No, this is in the 1970s.
70s.
This is the 1970s. 500,000 applied, and that carried ramifications. In many cases, Jews who weren't allowed to leave, and about half of them were not allowed to leave, they were fired from their jobs, put under surveillance. It was not a happy time for them, for the most part. And no one knew for sure if there wouldn't be a heavier hand of repression, except for a small number of sort of the biggest activists. That was about as difficult as it got. The question then became, in order to answer your question, okay, so 250,000 were allowed to leave. Did they all go to Israel? And the short answer is no. About half went to Israel, and the other half were called dropouts at the time, and they demanded actually, not to go to Israel, but to go to other places, United States, Canada, Europe, all over the place.
But still, it's quite a significant number, 1 in 4 Soviet Jews.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
It certainly is. Again, we're between 20 to 25% of all Soviet Jews. It is not insignificant, for sure. But again, it required
a certain risk. I mean, it's not just
and it did. We just need to be. Look, there was a debate in diaspora communities, not so much in Israel, but in diaspora communities. To what degree and how should we be supporting this national movement of Jews in the Soviet Union? And there were those, not a few, Jewish leaders in the diaspora who said, well, wait a minute. For the most part, and they weren't lying, for the most part, Soviet Jews lived a pretty good life in comparison to their non-Jewish neighbors. Perhaps not the same life that we were living in London or in Baltimore or what have you, or in Geneva, certainly not, but no one in the Soviet Union is. So there were, this is, again, as we said at the beginning, there are complexities here. Then if we want to be honest with ourselves, looking upon Jewish history and its implications for us today, we need to in a sober way, look at the complexities, because they tell us more than very simple black and white narratives.
Yeah. I wonder now about the post-1991 era. I mean, perhaps the third wave of the destruction of Soviet Jews, not destruction, not a physical one, but it's just almost gone entirely. So we said the first one was the immigration in the early 20th century, then the Holocaust, now the collapse of the Soviet Union. How do you see that space post 1991. I'll just give you one example. I mean, everyone's saying about Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. People mention this as an anecdote that he is Jewish, and of course he's the president of Ukraine and embroiled in this terrible war with Russia for more than 3 years now. Do you see that as anything more than just trivia? Is it really a significant characteristic of post-Soviet politics in any way?
Well, look just at Zelensky for a moment and how truly complicated it is. There was no secret when he was elected by the people of Ukraine to be their president. It was no secret that he was Jewish. On the contrary, it was very well known that he was Jewish. He was elected not because he was Jewish, but because he promised to eradicate the chronic corruption in the Ukrainian government. We don't know if he would have accomplished that because Russia invaded so quickly after his election that we just don't know if he would have lived up to that. What I find, however, the irony, and it's so illustrative of the history of Jews in Eastern Europe. So, in order to justify the invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, amongst other things, has claimed and continues once in a while to claim that Ukraine is full of fascists and neo-Nazis and so on, including, in a way, hinting that, well, of course, Zelensky is somehow complicit in this, which we could say is completely ludicrous, and at one level it is absolutely ludicrous. On the other hand, and here this is the harder part, certainly as anyone who is supportive of Ukraine and a small democracy trying to withstand an assault by a much, much larger autocracy. The Ukrainian national movement that, for all intents and purposes, Volodymyr Zelensky today is its head as president of Ukraine. That national movement has existed for a very long time. I would say, at the very least, one could say from the middle of the 17th century, there has been a Ukrainian national movement. It wouldn't have called itself that at that time, but later leaders, certainly that's where they identify it, which is significant. It's a significant movement. Let's say that's the good news. The not so good news, and the ironic part, is that many, not all, many of the iconic leaders of this Ukrainian nationalist movement, starting from its inception in the mid-17th century with the Cossack leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky, were complicit in the mass murder of Jews. That continued, that spanned from 1648, 1649, all the way to the Second World War, where Ukrainian militia units were formed by Ukrainian nationalist leaders in Poland and elsewhere and marched together with the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 and were highly complicit in the mass murder of Jews in Ukrainian and what became eventually Romanian-held territories. This is the truth. And to this day, you still see in democratic Ukraine statues to these men, postage stamps. Some of them are on Ukrainian currency. And here stands the president, sort of the icon, the modern icon of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, is a Jewish comedian who, until he was elected president of Ukraine, really didn't speak much Ukrainian at all.
Mm-hmm. And does he address this irony?
Not to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
No, but it's possible, but not to my knowledge.
Okay. All right, Professor Jonthan Dekel-Chen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Nevzlin Center for their generous support. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 1,000 interviews by now. And of course, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and now on Blue Sky as well. But most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here, goodbye.